Hello, my name's Andy. Today I'm going to discuss how to weigh arguments in British parliamentary debating. Let's start out by just laying a roadmap where we're going to go. First off, I'm going to describe what weighing is. Then I'm going to explain why you should weigh arguments against other ones. Then I'm going to have a extended discussion on how you should and shouldn't weigh arguments, discussing five different sections. And then I'm going to lay out how you should train your weighing. So, what is weighing? Basically, you would have seen this graph before potentially at some stage while you were debating. Here it describes the set of all arguments you can make. All arguments that you make must be at least somewhat true and somewhat important. If you have a very untrue, very unimportant argument, it's here. So for example, I don't know, if you were arguing that if we legalized all drugs, then all of the grass in the world would lean like 1 degrees another way. Like, I mean, I don't know, who cares? Then importance. Let's just say that you have a very important argument which is not true. So, for example, if you legalize all drugs, then nuclear war will break out. Cool. Then, for a very true, unimportant argument, you have if you legalize all drugs, then the newspapers will write more words about the policy. No one cares. Then in this, I guess, swathe in the middle here, you have all of the like actual arguments you might make within a debate. Um, Weighing is as follows. Imagine that you have two teams here, a team who closing opposition have proven this amount in terms of their argumentation. They have arguments which are reasonably important and very true, and then opening government have arguments which are very important and reasonably true. They're both fairly reasonable cases. Weighing is the ability to sensibly comment on why one team's endpoint is preferable to another's, and indeed persuade the judge that one team's endpoint is preferable. So, for example, if you were the opposition whip for closing opposition and you were trying to describe why you're better than opening government, you might say that your case is better proven than opening government, i.e., it might be more certain than opening government. Consequently, the judge should care about your analysis. Conversely, if you were in deputy prime minister and you were weighing in a bench weighing POI, let's just say against closing opposition, you might say, like, look, your case is very certain. However, it is a very small scale. We affect much more people to a much greater extent, consequently opening government over closing opposition. So that's how it works out. You basically point out where you are on the graph and the comparative advantage this gives you versus another team. Now, here, closing opposition and opening government are doing equally as well, roughly, except in different skill sets. So one of them is very, very good at like impacting their case and has proven something that's very important, but aren't as good at proving truth. The other team is doing the inverse. However, there will be many cases where like closing opposition will be down, sitting here around where the full stop is, and it's just very clear that opening government has defeated closing opposition. They might just say they might not even bench weigh against them at that stage. They might just rely on the judge. But weighing is what you do to try to evaluate reasonably close comparisons and explain why you've defeated an opponent if it is not obvious. And by obvious, I mean very obvious. So leave a margin for error here. Why should you weigh? There's a few reasons. The first and most straightforward is that it just dodges insertiveness from the judge, which is that judges don't like to insert their reasoning for why one clash has gone one way or another, or at least they shouldn't. Instead, they should defer to the analysis which is presented in the round by various teams. This does not mean a judge can't use their brain. So, for example, if they think that an argument makes no sense, then they're going to discredit it, or if they think that an argument is fantastic and deeply persuasive, then they'll be moved by it. However, if all else is equal, or not even all else is equal, but if you have two arguments which are roughly like similarly good, but one side is given a variety of strong reasons for why their argument is preferable to the other side's argument, beyond just explaining why their argument is good in itself, then the judge should side for the team who have provided the magic words and have asked very nicely for their case to be bought. The other second reason for why you should weigh is that often judges don't see the way the debates operate perfectly because they're operating under a variety of constraints. For example, they have limited time, they have limited cognition, they just might have a messy debate in front of them. And because of that, even though if they had all the time in the world, they might conclude that opening government have beaten opening opposition, if opening government and opening opposition are roughly close, but opening opposition, even though they might be losing, have given reasons for why they beat opening government, a stressed out judge might just put opening opposition over opening government, deferring back to the reasons that were given to them. The idea here is basically on scamming. Since judges are human and they don't see clashes in perfect detail, you should just say words that can lead you to beating teams that you shouldn't on paper just by being able to give an easy way out to the judge or explain to a confused judge why you've defeated an opposing team. weighing is handy in this instance. The final thing is nothing to do with actually beating teams directly by your weighing, but just the knock-on effects for the rest of your game. If you are forcing yourself to explain aloud to the judge why you are winning a given clash, this will improve loads of different skills. So, for instance, you will become more strategically clear because if you know that your pathway to beat your opening is to explain that your case fills in an analytical gap in theirs, and you're going to weigh on the extent of impact that you increase on your bench, then that means that you're going to gear the rest of your speech towards proving that. You're going to spend time explaining what your analysis was to fill that gap, why that gap was particularly salient, etc. For example, as well, if you're trying to explain why you've defeated a team because you have a more intense impact than them, you will do things like illustrate your impact to a greater extent, show why it's so important that your impact is prioritized within the debate, and this will make it more persuasive for the adjudicator that they ought to prioritize your impact. This will also do things like improve your cohesion because if two teams or two speakers within a team in prep time understand how you intend to win the debate, so for example, by proving a impact which is important because it is related to an actor to whom we owe a special duty, then that means that the first speaker will sufficiently analyze why that duty exists so that the second speaker can go about weighing why we ought to care about that duty versus other contributions within the round. So basically, if you understand how you're weighing, given that weighing is essentially your strategic take on the round, if you have more strategic clarity regarding how you were intending to win the debate, then you will naturally act in a manner which improves the clarity of the rest of your case. Now, with an explanation of why you should weigh out of the way, and the reason why I say this is because some people just think like, well, I mean, I'm obviously beating a team. Does it actually matter if I weigh over them? Weighing is fake, which was my take when I first started debating. These are the actual reasons that I've since learned are very important. Since judging, actually, it's become clear to me that weighing is actually very important. Now, the bulk of the workshop. How should and shouldn't you weigh? Here I want to discuss five different issues. The first issue, or the first step, I guess I'd say, is to treat weighing sections as mini arguments. The second is to use weighing metrics. The third is to weigh your weighing metrics against competing ones. The fourth is to respond to opposing weighing metrics. And the fifth is to make sure that you bench weigh appropriately. Let's go through those different steps. Firstly, on treating weighing as argumentation. The idea here is that a piece of weighing is an argument, not just a piece of commentary on the round. For instance, if you say just baldly with no explanation behind it, we in closing government beat closing opposition because we have a larger scale of impact, which I hear a lot at the intermediate to like beginner levels of debating, and even sometimes at advanced, but rarely. Why is the judge going to care about that piece of analysis? This is where weighing actually is useless, because either the judge already has a similar take, in which case you're just pointing back out the obvious to them, or they disagree with you, in which case you're not moving yourself any closer to persuading that judge that you're correct. Instead, you're just saying a slogan or you're saying something that you saw in a list or on a workshop. Just ticking the box of weighing is not enough. In the same way that listing the headline of a bunch of mechanisms for like I don't know 2 seconds on each of them does not mean that you actually have an argument. You need to explain how the mechanism works, how it links in with other mechanisms, and why it is a meaningful piece of analysis that pushes you towards your case's conclusion. The same goes for people who impact by just saying things like, the first impact is this makes people happier. The second impact is gives people more money. The third impact is that it allows people to be healthier. Like these are not impacts. Like you need to explain to me, like what does it look like? And the crucial thing here is that it's even worse actually than the impacting being short because weighing is a explanation which is either given to persuade the adjudicator to view a clash in a different order, or it is for them to give a different margin on a clash. So you're actively like trying to change their mind in this way. If you put out an impact, it's fairly intuitive, and you can add new value by seeing different implications that are pointed out. However, you're unlikely to get a different intuition about a clash by just seeing a bunch of one-word reasons that are given. It would be the same thing as, for example, if you were on the motion, this house would legalize all drugs, and your case just consisted of you saying, panel, we should legalize drugs because firstly, it will mean that we have better rehabilitation. Secondly, it will lead to fewer deaths of people who are in addiction. And thirdly, it is going to reduce the strength of gangs. Fourthly, it's going to improve tourism for areas which are legalizing these drugs. Thank you very much. Sit down. Like, sure, these are persuasive reasons in a vacuum, but you need to analyze why these reasons are true. You need to analyze how they're important. You need to talk to them about the extent of those reasons. The same goes for weighing. The second thing that I'd point out here is that because basically any weighing argument is an argument for the motion, this house believes that our case has beaten the other ones, all of your argumentation steps that you use to prove a normal argument must be applied to your weighing. For example, firstly, Summarize the thing that you are weighing against or the purpose of your weighing before you do it. In the same way that when you respond to an argument, you explain what that argument is and then engage with it, or at least you should. Summarizing requires you to say which claim you're actually weighing against. Are you weighing against a clash that several other teams have been involved in? Is it a specific team? So you're closing opposition taking on opening opposition, or were you just taking on the top half in general? Are you weighing in a vacuum? So, for example, you're not weighing directly versus opening opposition why your case matters, as like the deputy prime minister, but you're just arguing in general why your case is very, very important, and in general why we should care about the intensity of the people affected or their vulnerability, which allows you to position your case against teams in the back half of the debate because you've given general weighing as to why your case matters. Also, what version of a claim are you engaging with? So if you say I'm weighing against opening government's argument on backlash, which version, the one in the PM or the DPM? Well, how is it specifically worded? Which part of it? Like these are, you don't need to go super into detail. So it's not like I'm weighing against the argument that was made by the deputy leader of the opposition at 2 minutes and 5 seconds into their like second argument. Like this is not like that level of granularity. Like be sensible. Instead, just explain to me what the like general like what is the section of the speech that you're engaging in? What's the 2 to 3 minute block that you are trying to explain was less important than what you were arguing? Also, this goes for your own case. So be very clear when you're summarizing what is the analysis that you are bringing to compare to an opposing side. Secondly, you should mechanize. If you are making an argument for the motion, again, this house believes that our case has beaten the other ones, and the headline of the argument is scale, then the reasons that you give for this is pointing to examples from your case for where you have proven that you have a large scale of impact, because that establishes that your claim is true, that you are winning on scale. So, for instance, go back through your individual mechanisms you gave to prove the impact that occurs to a lot of people. Explain why those should lead the adjudicator to the conclusion that you have accessed a large scale of people who you are helping out. And you should also then explain what the scale of your opponent's case looks like in this instance. Because if you're beating a team, then not only are you doing something well, but they're doing something less well. So explain what their scale is and where it is limited, and then compare them. So establish what the relative margin is between the two of you. This is the three-step bit to mechanizing. The truth, which is what have you said that would lead you to believe that that weighing metric applies to you? So, for example, if you're weighing on vulnerability, why is it that the very vulnerable people are affected by your side of the house? Then why are very vulnerable people not affected by the other side of the house? And then why should we care more about your group that are affected than the other side's group? Or why do you affect more vulnerable people? Why are you winning on that clash, essentially? The next part of this, though, and this is the bit which is left out by nearly everybody, is explaining why I should care about the metric that you're talking about. So, for example, why do I care about vulnerability? Why do I care about scale? I'll explain how to do this later, but it's not just caring about them in a vacuum, but it's also why do I care about vulnerability more than scale or scale more than vulnerability? I'll get into that in a second. I did hint at doing this in a previous workshop. I'm going to actually do it in this one. Third, you should diversify. So, in the same way that you might run multiple arguments in a speech, or multiple reasons under one argument, or multiple responses versus another team, you should also try to like claim multiple reasons for why your case beats another case in terms of weighing. Now, there's two extremes which are done here, neither of which work. One is just like giving one half-assed reason, or even like very persuasive reason for why your case beats another case. This can work if it's like a very, very good reason, but usually you'll want to give a couple just to hedge your bets. The other extreme, which I think is far worse, is just standing up and listing like 10 weighing reasons why you beat the other side, or 5 weighing reasons, without actually like explaining what those reasons are or how they apply to your case. Make sure that you say, our case beats the other side on this metric, but even if it doesn't win on metric A, it wins on metric B because of these separate reasons. So even if we're not able to defeat our opponents on the short-termist intense harms that occur, we're able to defeat them because there's a special duty that we should feel towards these people, where these actors we're discussing, where even if the effect of them is not particularly intense, we should care about any effect that occurs to them more than an effect that occurs to another person. So that's how you can do it. Give your weighing metric, even if that metric doesn't apply, give another metric instead of spamming nonsense metrics or just relying on one being bought. The final thing is clarity. This is so important. In plain English, explain to the adjudicator what your metric is and how it works. So, for example, instead of saying we went on scale, say we affect more people. This sounds less efficient, but actually is way more efficient because you're being more sufficient. You're explaining something to the judge which is actually digestible, which they can verify, which they have an intuition aligned with. So if you were to say to me that this is one of the most common ways that people get discredited in weighing, we win on vulnerability. A lot of judges just won't care. They'll be like, why do I care about vulnerable people more than non-vulnerable people? Now, personally, I like if you run it in front of me, I'll probably be fine. I care. I'll buy that more vulnerable people matter more. But if you need to, like, I understand why some judges feel like you need to mechanize this. So, because they might just think, look, we're all born basically equal. Sure, if you're vulnerable, that's hard for you, but why should I intrinsically care about effects to you more than others? Here's what you say instead. Our case is more important because it provides benefits to people who would otherwise feel exceptionally destitute and have no other way to claw themselves out of cycles where they are negatively being harmed and where their life is getting worse and worse. These people did not deserve to be in situations where they were more vulnerable than others in society. Often it was due to factors outside of their control, which means that we ought to afford these people sympathy. Because I could end up in that position as well, feasibly, there's a degree of moral luck associated with this. And I should treat another person as I would want to be treated myself, almost like a golden rule. And um, because of that, we ought to care a lot about helping out people who would otherwise be hurt a lot more or would not be able to avoid the pain which is foisted upon them. Something like this. Like that might be a little bit long-winded, and if you're writing it down word for word, you could probably say it more efficiently. However, that general idea is correct, which is pointing out why is it that the implication for the actor you were discussing is important by explaining why the metric is something that we should care about using plain English. So another one is if you're analytically weighing, so for example, saying that our case is lower burden than an opposing team, you instead of saying we win because we're lower burden, nonsense. That doesn't mean anything. Say our in order to believe our case, you only need to believe this one thing. But in order to believe their case, you need to believe this step and this step and this step, and we've casted doubt on several of them. Therefore, there are just so many points of failure within their argument. There are far fewer things you need to believe for our case to operate. Consequently, you should side for ours. Something like this, you know? Don't use like the nonsense buzzwords because people tend towards them too much, because judges are automatically somewhat in the back of their head discrediting them because they're thinking like, wait, did you really win on scale or whatnot? And also because it's just more persuasive, I think, like more tangible for you to give an explanation of something which is I guess clearly communicated and can be applied or and tailored to your case. If you look at the best weighing speakers in the world, they don't list all these nonsense metrics. They use the metrics as heuristics to generate reasons for why their case is defeated an opposing case. In the same way, the best speakers in the world generally don't just pull out a case file and read word for word. They use the analysis that's present in their case file to generate arguments that they tailor for the given debate. But after I've just trashed weighing metrics, let's go through them. What is the purpose of a weighing metric? So, for example, scale, certainty, intensity, vulnerability, whatever. The idea is it's the same as any other stock analysis. Stock analysis, so having a list of basic reasons you can apply to a variety of debates, saves you time. It can improve the quality of your analysis because you can think about it beforehand instead of coming up on the fly. It can be very beneficial. All weighing metrics are stock arguments which reach the conclusion that argument X has beaten argument Y. With that said, I just want to provide a warning or restate a warning, which is that using a bunch of metrics, like just listing a bunch, is not a winning tactic. And you should use as few or as many as you need to persuade the adjudicator. I've given you a reason in the previous section for why you might want to use more than one because it hedges your bets, insulates against risk. However, don't use, if you have one reason, which is enough to beat a team, use it. If you have four reasons and that's why you need to beat a team, use it. You probably won't need like 10. With that said, and with the warnings out of the way, here's a list. There are two kinds of weighing. One is a weighing for why one side's impact is more important than another side's impact, and the other is a reason for why the other side's one side's argument is better proven than another side's argument. If you think about this on the truth and importance graph, impact weighing, so impact A over impact B, is the important side. Our claim is more important. The claim on our argument is better proven than their argument is a truth claim. Our claim is more true, it is more likely to reach its conclusion. Now, of course, if a claim is more likely to reach its conclusion, it is probably more true. If an argument is more important, it is also probably reasonably well proven. How like the words importance and truth are like fairly intertwined within debating. So think about it this way. Is an impact better than another impact? Is a piece of analysis better than another piece of analysis? You're either weighing impact or weighing max. Let's talk about weighing impacts. This is the vast majority of weighing you'll ever do. Firstly, scale. Our impact occurs in more cases than their impact. So more people will be harmed or benefited. Standard reason, very classic. Another reason you can give is intensity, which is that your harm or benefit is felt more acutely by the people who are affected by it than the other side's harm or benefit. A derivative of this, or some sort of, I guess, spin-off piece of weighing, which is often said as separate, but I think is just a subset of intensity weighing, is vulnerability weighing, which is that our effect occurs to an actor who is less able to insulate themselves against the harm, or is more benefited by the good thing than the actors on the other side. A very useful piece of weighing. I've given you an example previously of how you can use this weighing without just using the buzzword. Another piece of weighing is duty, which is that the actor who is impacted has a some sort of special moral status, which means that we ought to afford them benefits to a greater extent than others. A couple of classic examples of duties, there are reciprocal duties. So, for example, a justification for reparations, where if you harm somebody, you ought to give them back what you took away from them, or you ought to try to reverse that harm. This is just a very commonly held intuition. I think it's probably correct. Another intuition is in terms of things like and it's actually closely tied, but it's on special moral obligations. So, for example, the intuition that you ought to take care of your child instead of another child as a parent, and even if those children are equally vulnerable and in tough positions. Why is that the case? Well, one reason you might give is because that child only exists and feels suffering and things like this because of your active choice, which means that by proxy, you have committed any harm that occurs to that child, at least to some extent, which means that you owe them a reciprocal obligation. But there's also another thing, which is that you're usually best positioned to help out those who are within your own care, or uniquely positioned. So if you have a baby who's in a bath, you're uniquely positioned to take care of that baby compared to somebody else who is not in your house, right? Now, by that same logic, if you were a carer who's taking care of a child, you might have a greater obligation to take care of that child than a parent who is off at work or something like this, who has explicitly delegated their responsibility over that child to you. So that's how that obligation might work. Proximity might be one. Then another one is prevention. This is a different metric. So the idea with prevention is that their argument might reverse or mitigate a harm. So for example, in the motion, this house would not like whack Andy in the face with a baseball bat and like break my nose. They might counterprop that instead they're going to give me amazing medical care after the fact. But you could say, sure, like you might mitigate the harm by making Andy's nose a little bit less broken. However, it is better to prevent the break in the first place, because that prevents the bulk of the harm. This is not like, okay, this is usually just true that like preventing a harm is better than reversing or mitigating the harm, unless the reversal or mitigation process leads to fewer harms into the future, or the reversal or mitigation process is sufficiently good that it means that the harm that occurs is actually not just reversed, but also made actively better post fact. These are ways that you can weigh against the idea of prevention, and there are some subsets and special cases where preventing a harm is not the most important thing. However, in most cases, preventing a harm is better than just trying to fix it once it's already happened. I think this is fairly intuitive. With that said, those are the main reasons you should give for why an impact is better than another impact. There are some that I haven't put in here that you might be like, wait, what, like, where's long-term weighing? Where's short-term weighing? But like long-term weighing is that there'll be more things that will happen in the future. Consequently, there's a bigger scale. So it's scale weighing. And short-term weighing is, well, it's more certain because we know it's going to happen in the immediate term. So that's certainty weighing, which is in the next section. Or perhaps it's more intense because it's a very concentrated short-term effect. That's intensity weighing. So some of these pieces of weighing just derive from each other. I think these pieces of weighing are not the same as each other. Like I think that there is a difference between a small impact to a lot of people versus a big impact to a small number of people versus a small number of people who can't help themselves, which was why they're tied, versus it doesn't really matter how big or small the impact is, it matters who the person is, versus some sort of qualitative way of dealing with harms and benefits, which is prevention weighing. However, maybe there are overlaps that you can spot between these, and maybe there are other pieces of weighing I've missed. But if you know these, you can probably weigh any argument versus any argument in terms of an impact versus an impact. Let's talk about the analysis for an argument being more important than the analysis for another argument. The first thing I want to point out is just an analytical priority weighing. This is really important to use like the actual real term words to describe this instead of just saying analytical priority, because this weighing is spammed so much in debating that it's just like not useful in many cases. The idea is the benefit of a team can only happen once your benefit or once your case has occurred, which means that their case is contingent on the success of your case. So I'll give you an example of this. In the in a motion in which a policy is being passed, which is controversial, so this house supports bans on smoking, you might argue in opening government that the government, like the actual like government, are a actor who would have good incentives regarding putting in a smoking ban. However, if you're not able to explain the government is able to effectively police smoking and actually put in this ban, then the impact that you derive, which is that fewer people smoke, that this is good for people's health, whatever it may be, is very, very limited. If closing government stand up and they explain that we should support this policy because the government would enact the smoking ban in an effective manner, which reduces smoking and means that there are fewer deaths and fewer illnesses, then this means that opening government's impact can only occur once closing government's reasons have been applied, i.e., opening government can only claim reasonably that they're going to reduce the amount of smoking if closing government's analysis is correct that the government has the ability to do this. This is true for many different kinds of motions, where one side's arguments are logically necessary for another side's arguments to arise. But you should explain it in those terms. So say if opening government are unable to get the or unable to prove that this ban will actually be effective for people, then they are also unable to prevent people from smoking and prevent the consequent harms. Therefore, the analysis that comes from my partner, which explains that we can prevent people from smoking, is the logical requirement for their analysis to work, placing us analytically prior to our opening. Something like this. That's a good piece of weighing. A bad piece of weighing is saying, firstly, we beat our opening because we're analytically prior because they need us for their impact. Like what? Or even worse, we're analytically prior, we have a bigger impact, we have more scale, we win in the long run. Like you genuinely hear this a lot in debates. Not useful. If you're doing it right now, avoid it. Don't worry about it. No judgment though. We've all been there. That was how I started weighing as well. Certainty. Here's the second reason for why analysis might be better than other analysis. It's just more certain. There's a number of ways in which analysis can be more certain than another team's analysis. One can be that your reasons are just better than their reasons. So point out that they haven't proven, or even in many cases haven't provided reasons for their argument where you have. And that means that it is more likely that your effect occurs because of your reasons. Also, you can say that their argument has more burdens within it. I already explained the higher burden, lower burden thing in the previous note about weighing very clear, or yeah, explaining weighing metrics clearly, which is if their argument has many different steps in order to be believed, then all that you need for their argument to not work is for one of those steps to be beaten. We have challenges against all of them, which means that there's a high probability that one of them does not work, and maybe point out one that you think might fail. However, our case only has one point of failure. It doesn't have that many burdens. Consequently, it is more likely that our impact arises because our one step is very well defended and very robust. So certainty, if your analysis is more likely to occur or your impact is more likely to arise, then clearly your case is better than theirs, at least in that way. Thirdly, applicability. So this is for specific motions. For example, if the motion is an actor's motion, this house as I don't know, this house as Andy regrets the like I don't know the creation of APTA or something, then like you can argue all you want about like the benefits of APTA as a debating format in the US. Let's use actually an accessible example. Sorry, this is kind of bizarre. Let's say this house as like as Donald Trump uh regrets the focus on the World Cup in the US, which is going on at the minute. Sure, fine. I can live with that one. In that case, you can talk about whether or not the World Cup is good or bad in a vacuum. However, you need to situate this within the things that Trump cares about, which admittedly can be a difficult thing to decipher, but whatever. Within that, if one side has explained what is relevant for the actor in the debate, so Andy's caring about APTA or Donald Trump's caring about the World Cup that is occurring in the US, then their case is more applicable to the motion than the other side's case. If you haven't is situated within the interest of the actor. If the motion is this house as the feminist movement would condemn military interventions, then talk to me about what the feminist movement cares about, not just about whether military interventions are good or bad. Same goes for motions that are predicts motions, which have certain time frames. So, for example, if the motion is, as I said, at QUB Open earlier on this year, this house predicts that we'll have a united Ireland by 2045. If the opposing, if one side argues that we will have a united Ireland at some stage in the future, and they give a bunch of reasons, but they don't grapple with the fact that there is a time constraint by 2045, and the opposing side explains that you cannot overcome the time constraint, then that means that your case is more applicable. The side which explains why you are unable to overcome the 20-year time horizon, because you've actually answered every part of the motion. Same goes for regrets debate, where it's like this house regrets the creation of money. In that debate, there is a burden on sides to explain what would have occurred counterfactually if the creation of money had not have happened. If one side does not explain what the alternative would have looked like, without money, then de facto their case is just less applicable. It is not fulfilling something which is part of the motion. Another piece of weighing is on intuitiveness. This might seem kind of like a strange heading, but bear with me. The idea is if you have a principle which implies a very strange outcome, like out of it, then you should probably point that out. Or if you have an argument which implies a very strange outcome. For example, in the Trinity Open final, the motion was about whether or not we should canonize Mother Teresa. We were in opening government, and we made an argument to the effect of that you should canonize her not because she's a good person, but because the act of canonizing, and by the way, she has been canonized. This argument isn't relevant to reality, but let's just take the example for now. You should canonize Mother Teresa because that will lead to an increase in charitable donations and increased scrutiny of the negative things that she has done because she'd be more basically all of it is just because she'd be more popular, or like more discussed, I guess. The POI that we get is essentially a piece of intuitiveness weighing, which is hold on, if we're willing to canonize people who are not good just because it leads to like more scrutiny and donations, would you canonize like Benjamin Netanyahu? Like that is a form of intuitiveness weighing, which is like basically your case implies something that we all think is very, very strange. Therefore your case is probably like not that persuasive. Like I said, your logic doesn't hold. It doesn't hold if it's positioned in another context. Now, on to weighing metrics. So I've discussed all of the different ways you can weigh arguments which are actually like important or useful that I found. Now let's talk about how you can weigh those metrics against each other. This is a emerging field of BP. If there was like ever such a thing as an emerging field, like this is not academic research, but like to the extent that we are actually learning things and researching, it is an area which has probably the highest upside because people are very bad at weighing metrics versus each other in the current meta. And also like very few people are thinking about this. I'm just taking a stab at it. I would appreciate if other people help me. Drop some suggestions in the comment section below, as they say on the YouTube as it is. But what I mean here is the thing that I'm about to describe to you, the skill that I'm about to illustrate, is not something which a lot of people do. The basics idea of this skill is something like if we have an argument in opening government which is beating opening opposition on scale, and they have an argument in opening opposition which is more certain than ours is, how do we adjudicate who has won that clash? You need to give reasons for why scale is a more important consideration than certainty in a vacuum. Or, well, more generally, with respect to the way that scale and certainty plays out in this motion. How does this work? Well, you just mech it like you would with any form of weighing. But there is a concern here. Let's just say that I find reason A for why scale is more important than certainty, and the opposing speaker finds reason B for why certainty is more important than scale. Then, do we have to find a new tier of weighing to explain why A beats B? This is the fear about infinite regress. This is more of a philosophical concern. I think, yeah, to an extent, you probably do need to keep coming up with more and more weighing reasons if you were trying to do this as a perfect logic game. However, this is not practically useful because right now people are not actually giving reasons for why we should care more about like certainty than scale or vice versa. They're just like saying, "Oh, we went on certainty, we went on scale," and then they're hoping the judge like throws the dart at like their team, which is just as bad, or like not just as bad, but it's if both teams are doing it to the same extent, if both teams are giving a metric and justifying it, like as in are explaining why their case fulfills that metric, then you're back at the same level as if both teams had just said their metric out loud but not explained it. And the judge had bought that it applied to both. Because then the judge again is just picking, which you don't want. That again demands assertiveness. This is a way around that assertiveness by going the next step and making the deeper level of comparison for why you should care about one set of weighing over another. Um, with that said, let's illustrate what this looks like graphically, because this might be kind of unintuitive to start out. So take this impact graph that I showed earlier. Um, take the the claim that our claim wins on scale, right? Um, This is a piece of weighing that is presented by a team. However, we don't know if the judge believes that. The judge may or may not. The judge could look at that and they could say, "Oh, it's actually it's here. Like I don't believe that at all. Yeah, I don't believe that you're winning on scale. I don't believe the winning on scale even matters. Whatever it may be. Also, by the way, there's a flash when I'm like pressing the arrow key between these, and it keeps popping up like underlying. Because I pasted this later, it has stuff like, oh, insert graph that shows this. So like in case you were wondering what the flash is, you're not going crazy. But yeah, it's nothing terribly interesting. So yeah, they might believe otherwise that actually it's there. They might believe that, oh, well, actually, yeah, you know what? They are winning on scale. That's very important. Or they might believe, as have I blocked it again? Um, they might believe here, they might be like, oh, yeah, they're winning on scale, but it's not actually that important. I don't really care about scale. Like another team is winning on a more important metric. They might believe it here, etc. Right? It's very, very random. And it's hopelessly random, one might say, because if you just say the heading, we win on scale, then four different judges could believe it to these four different extents, right? Um, but we can just say as a baseline, let's just say that winning on scale looks like this, right? If you say the phrase, oh, I win on scale, this is how much the judge believes it. How can you make this closer to here? How can you make it so the judge really believes you and thinks it's really important? Well, one way you can do this, and the way that most good weighing debaters do it, is they say, here are examples of the scale that occurs in our case. So here's, they give evidence from their case to explain where they have accessed a large scale. Or let's just ignore scale for a second. Let's talk about certainty. They give examples of the depth of mechanization they gave to explain why their case is going to occur, or the small number of burdens which are necessary for their case to materialize. Then you can make it even better. And the way you do this is by explaining that your opponent's scale or your opponent's certainty is small, because this makes it even more true that you're winning on scale or certainty, because it's very, very true that you're winning on scale and certainty if you have a very high scale or very certain claim. And it's even more so if your opponent doesn't have a very high scale or very certain claim, because then if you're doing very well and they're not doing very well, then you're very likely winning on that. It's very true. However, how do you move this way? This is what people aren't doing right now, or at least not a lot of people. I've been in a lot of good rooms. I've never really seen people do this. Here's what you do. What you do is you give reasons, excuse me, I'll get out of the way. You give reasons for why one weighing metric, so for example, you winning on scale, is more important than another team winning on something like intensity. That will bring you from here to here. How do you do that? So what I'm going to do is give you a couple different comparisons of like scale versus certainty, long term versus short term, and explain how you can weigh one over the other. I'm not doing this to exhaustively catalog all of the ways you can compare one set of impacts to another. The reason for this is because there's just too many of them to like feasibly do within a workshop, or like maybe not. Maybe I could sit here for a couple hours and grind it out, but I think that that wouldn't be particularly useful as well. And the reason for that is that weighing metrics are often deployed relative to the arguments that are specifically made within a round. If you have like different types of arguments, then you're going to have different types of comparisons for why scale beats certainty or vice versa, depending on the type of certain argument they have. Like, is it that they have a low burden argument? Is it that they have like loads of mechs? Or like the type of scale you're talking about. So is it that a lot of people are affected right now? Is it that in the long run a lot of people are affected, etc.? So there's just too much variation for you to try to copy my list of reasons. However, I'm going to show you how I would go about weighing one set of weighing metrics versus another so that you can hopefully emulate this for yourself. So let's start with an example of scale over intensity. So why should I care about a high scale impact more than an intense impact? I'm going to go through these explanations quite quickly because again, I don't want you to take this as stock. I just want to give you an explanation of how I might go about this. And these aren't perfect reasons by any means. Some of them probably don't apply. Some of them you could find much better reasons. Feel free to comment with them and also pick two random metrics from the previous section and weigh them versus each other. So on scale, you might care about scale more because there's diminishing returns to pain or pleasure that are felt by people. So for example, if you have a motion that's like this house would give like $10,000 to a bunch of people, like sure, versus what's it called? This house give $10,000 to a bunch of people versus we give $100,000 to a small group of people, right? Um, if you give a person who has nothing like $100,000, that's a huge, huge impact for their life. If you give somebody who's very, very wealthy like $100,000, that's a very small impact for their life. So if you make somebody who is feeling something even more intense, like the next amount of money is going to be, or the amount of happiness is going to be quite small. How do I illustrate this with a slightly clearer example? I feel like that might have been a little bit botched. The idea is that because of diminishing returns, people who feel very happy, it's very difficult to make them more happy. You have to do like a lot to make them more happy. And people who are sad, you need to do a lot more to make them more sad. So if somebody is living the worst day of their life, then having a bird like poop on them is gonna have a very small difference. So like if I've like lost my job, lost somebody close to me, I'm very sick, and then like a bird poops on me, I'll probably be like, this is really bad. You might even like laugh, you might be like, this is ridiculous. Like the world's just like clowning on me so much that it's almost comical. However, if you are like an average person having that happen to you, then that's going to have a fairly big effect on you. So if you have a small additional harm that occurs to somebody who's already been hurt, which is intensity. Like over time, each additional unit of pain gets less and less painful. Each additional unit of happiness gets less and less happy, versus a unit of happiness or sadness occurring to somebody who's otherwise not disposed either way. There's a much larger jump for the average person, which means that even if the people who are intensely affected end up having a more intense emotion than the people who are just affected a little bit on scale, the margin between each increase in the effect to somebody who's intensely affected is smaller than the margin for each individual person who is affected in a large group. That's the way you might do it. So diminishing returns. Another reason you might give is that there are the harm that is being visited upon people violates an inviolable right of somebody, and because of that, because people are equal in dignity or respect or whatnot, this principled harm occurring to a large group of people as a unitary harm is extremely bad and matters a lot compared to a change in a scalar harm to a group of people. So we have basically counting it as like we have more people affected and the effect is roughly equal because any violation of somebody's rights is broadly the same. It's not something which exists scalar, it's something which you either violate or you don't. It's a binary switch. Another thing you can do is certainty. So you say that certainly we know that the harm or benefit that happens to somebody is harmful or beneficial. However, we can't look in somebody's head and actually see how intensely affected they are. So we ought to care about effects to a large group of people because we're more certain that somebody will be positively or negatively affected than we are about the degree to which they'll be positively or negatively affected, even if the same amount of input pain or input pleasure is put onto somebody, they internalize it in different ways. So, for example, I could be living the happiest time of my life on paper, but I could feel quite miserable. So I could be like, I could have loads of amazing people around me. I could be successful. I could like have loads of various markers, be healthy, but still be very, very, very sad. Whereas another person could have that and be very, very, very happy. Just judging people by their external stimuli, the book by its cover, is not as useful as just judging if we give a bunch of people on average health, then that will be very, very good. So it's more certain that the benefit will materialize for this group of people than that a certain person is intensely feeling it or not. Let's do the opposite, intensity over scale. First reason, long term, if people are only hurt or benefited to a small extent, then they adjust their psychological and behavioral preferences such that they like even out over time. So if you give like every single person like I don't know a bar of chocolate, like they're probably happy for a bit, but like they just move on. Or if you give every single person like a slight subsidy on their house, like or sorry, yeah, like on their housing, then that might mean that it's great because they have that money in their pocket, but they find a new thing to spend it on, which may or may not be useful. Whereas if you give like a group of people who are very, very poor a house, that's going to have a massive scalar impact on the trajectory of their life because now they're able to apply for loans. Now they're able to bring people back to their house where they couldn't previously. Now they're able to feel dignity in themselves and be more safe and things like this. So basically over time the effects that occurs to somebody is going to have a larger change in the trajectory of their life if it is a big effect to a small number of people than a small effect which people adjust to in a manner which means that their life resembles what it did prior to the effect occurring. A second thing you can do is risk aversion, which is just given rational reasons for why you should care more about large harms being avoided than you should care about like diffuse benefits. So a couple of reasons for this. One is irreversibility. So if there's very large harm, you can't turn it back, whereas you can probably compensate for benefits in other ways. Another is psychological, the psychological mismatch between pleasure and pain. People really, really hate pain more than they like pleasure, which means that we should avoid massive amounts of pain, whatever it may be. You need to prove that as well. This is just me spitballing. With that said, you should be disproportionately concerned about intense harms. Another reason could be minority effects, which is just given the fact that the intense harm affects a small number of people and makes them out to be a minority, it means that they are less able to deal with the effects of being a minority. So, for example, if a group of people are suddenly they're suddenly victims of violence as a result of a policy, and the rest of society get like more money or something, that group, because they are a minority affected by violence, end up getting seen differently by society in various other ways. So, for example, there are justifications that are made for why they had violence enacted upon them. They start to identify themselves with others around them, and they have low expectations about their future. There are fewer people within that minority who are able to share ideas to try to ameliorate the wrongs. They cannot act as a collective like group to be able to like change society in a manner which adjusts for those wrongs, whereas like a larger majority, if they have like a small harm upon them, are able to do things like pass policy and collectivize, and also just feel more comfort because there's more people around you feeling the same thing, so you feel less isolated. These are some weighting metrics you can give these are some reasons you can give for why being in a minority in itself, which is implied by intensity for a number of people. Because if it's an intense impact for a lot of people, then you also scale, right? I'm assuming there's a trade-off. If it's a small number of people, there are reasons for why that could be particularly bad. Now, just quickly, because you get the idea at this stage, I'd say, why is the long term more important than the short term? One reason might be scale. The future is longer than the present, as Team China's third speaker said against me in round four of the World Schools Debating Championships in 2023. I think that might have been Stephanie Chen actually, but that was a round where we got slaughtered. But the only thing that came out of that round, apart from people coming up to me literally years later and saying I spoke badly, is the fact that I learned this beautiful piece of phrasing. The future is longer than the present. That's a good piece of scale weighing. Another thing you can also nuance this by talking about future generations who we might have an obligation towards in the future. Also, improvement. Over time, we'll figure out ways of improving the harms that occur from the short-termist side. But if you take only the short-term benefit, we don't manage to make it better into the long run. We settle for this as a fine solution. Maybe we exhaust our political capital or something. Another reason you might give is counterbalancing, which is that we have a variety of psychological biases towards the short term, which means that we should, like for example, hyperbolic discounting, where we care more about getting like €100 today than getting like €200 in like a couple of months. Even though like inflation isn't going to make them equal, you'll still get more money in the future. Why then should we end up caring more about the long run? We should actively orient ourselves against our irrational intuitions so that we hedge our bets and so that we don't end up pushing all of our priorities in the short run and rushing them and doing them badly or something. You can also do the opposite. So, why is the short term preferable to the long run? One is just duties. So, we have a duty to people who exist right now. The state, as a entity which takes away our rights and bestows us with certain freedoms and fulfills obligations in return, has obligations towards people who vote and control it at the minute rather than people who may or may not exist in the future. So just we have a duty to the now, not a duty to the future. Another is certainty, which is we know what the problems are now and how we can solve them. We don't actually know what's going to happen in the future. So yeah, maybe we put in this amazing trade deal, but then like, I don't know, the United States decides they're going to go invade a country that's related to the bloc, and then the whole thing just falls apart. Whereas we can know right now that we're going to actually improve things. We know people's preferences right now. We know what our constraints are right now. We're not going to bank on tomorrow. The other one is a prerequisite, which is that if we can't deal with the problems of now, we don't have a future. So things like, or we can't address the future adequately is a more nuanced version. So for example, with climate change, if we don't address current environmental issues, then we lose our capacity over time to address future ones because it starts to scale in terms of environmental damage and our ability to deal with it or resolve rapidly decreases. Same for conflict. If we can't prevent a war right now, then it's harder to do humanitarian policies into the future because, yeah, well, like obvious reasons, war makes it difficult to do policy. Now, I'm going to talk about the last thing in terms of improvement, which is bench weighing, or like the last skill thing. Just checking my laptop battery. Yeah, it's fine. I'll survive. Bench weighing. The first thing I'll say about bench weighing is and this is where you're like in closing opposition weighing against opening opposition, for example. You should use your opponents. So let's just say you're the government whip weighing against opening government. You should use opening opposition and the member of opposition's responses to point out issues with opening government before you weigh against them. There are a variety of reasons why this is useful. One is if you can like sidestep the problems with opening government, then you'll probably be able to beat them quite quickly just by virtue of having a case which isn't damaged as much. You could also defend your bench against the responses, which means that you your opening's case is reliant on yours in order to succeed. So analytical priority weighing. Another thing is that it's just like obviously just easier to beat a team that's worse. And if the responses make your opening seem worse, then you're more likely to beat them. So that's using your opponents. And very, very important thing. All the top speakers do it. Another thing on knifing. Here, I'm just going to try not get sidetracked on this because this is a passionate issue of mine. But there are basically two ways you can knife your opening if you're doing bench weighing or if you're like doing bench work in general. One is if you run a case which contradicts theirs. This isn't really weighing. This is just unrelated knifing. The other one is if you directly refute your opening's case in the sake of weighing against them. Um, I think you should try to avoid both scenarios because they're risky, because some judges are more punitive than others, and because often skill issues just mean that you end up doing it very poorly and crassly in a way which makes the round worse, and makes your case look worse, which wastes time, which takes away speaks, which reduces your breaking chances, and so on. And also, you often just don't need to. But if you have to do them, let's talk about it. This is a tangent, this first section on running contradictory cases. This has nothing to do with weighing, but it has everything to do with knifing. And while I'm talking about knifing, I might as well discuss it. There are three scenarios where it makes sense to run a case that contradicts your opening, or it like cannot exist at the same time as theirs. The first is if your opening's case is if your opening's case is only made in that way so that it can prevent you from running an extension. So if, for example, you are up against an opening team who let's just say that I'll take an example of Trinity Open, round one, 2024. The motion is this house prefers a world where there's like a ghost afterlife where people live around and they float and they like still feel things. We ran opening opposition. It would be terrible to be a ghost, so we don't want to have that happen to us. Closing opposition, we knew that because we burnt everything on what it felt like to be a ghost and our closing were very good, we knew they were going to run that people in the world would be worse off if ghosts did exist. And so we ran analysis, or I ran like a minute explaining why you'll never be able to interact with ghosts, even though the info side heavily indicated you would be able to. The reason for this is just because they'd have to run a knife of our case. And the actual strategic purpose of doing this is even though like they actually could do it without knifing us. They have to spend a lot of time justifying why they're not a knife, which wastes a lot of time for them. So that's even more dark artsy. But whatever, I can do a video on scamming if people want in the future. There's a lot of nice little tricks that exist in debating. But take that for instance. If your opening just runs the analysis like I did, which is, oh, you'll never be able to interact with these ghosts, that doesn't add an impact to our side. All it does is kill the closing team. You're allowed to ignore that. The manual says so. The second thing is if your opening's case is really ridiculous, like they misread the motion or something, or like they're running like the wildest misinterpretation, they're squirreling the motion. The motion is this house would ban boxing, and they start running cases about Amazon packages instead of about like people punching each other in the face. Ignore them, run a different case, that's fine. The other thing though is if your argument is neither of these two things, so it is a case which is contradictory to your opening and it does hurt your opening, then you should probably explain it as a response to the opposing side. So you can say, look, our case isn't our case just exists in the best case scenario of the opposing opening team. I'll give you an example of this. The Oxford IB final in 2025 was this house believes that most people won't go to secular heaven, I think. Something like that, there's similar wording. Basically, whether humans are good or bad. An opening government run a very good case, and they're like, we won't go to heaven because we all support the meat industry. The meat industry is atrocious. Animal suffering is the worst thing in the world. And yeah, they do win the debate on a 3-2-2 split, if I remember correctly. I wasn't there, but I was chatting to people after the round. Opening opposition run, the people are actually very good, and that's why we'll go to heaven. Closing opposition realize, hold on a second, opening government are beating opening opposition. They have explained that people are on balance bad people. The people are on balance, they do more bad things than good. What is our way to do this? We're going to say, even if opening government are correct that most people are bad, so this is a knife of their opening, we would say that God decides to put people into secular heaven on the basis of them being morally flawed rather than being morally good, which means that the metric is such that if opening government is correct, they prove our side. So they try to flip. If you're running your case as a flip of the opposing opening team, this is effective, it's fine. That's how you can knife with a case. Now, let's talk about the weighing bit. This is more directly relevant. If you're directly rebutting your opening, there are two different pieces of advice I have here. First, if it's rebuttal to a clash which you're opening and another opposing team are arguing about, then you can then you can phrase it as rebuttal to another team rather than your opening. So, for example, if you're in a case where like I'll take the Euros final from 2022, the motion about like this house hopes that alien life exists. Opening opposition have argued that they hope that alien life doesn't exist because life is suffering. Closing government argue that they hope alien life does exist because life is good. If you were in closing opposition, you could argue that we don't have a single clue what aliens feel like, and consequently, we should care more about the impact on humans at home, which is broadly the strategy taken. The way to do this strategy optimally, I think, is instead of responding to opening oppositions, framing that we know that aliens can feel pleasure and pain, respond to closing government's assumption that aliens can feel pleasure and pain, and then point out that there are implications for your own opening. So make it seem like a response to the other side, even though your opening is also engaged on that clash. And you can say, look, we're flipping the opposing team, but this also has implications. You should think about how this interacts with OO. But let's say you're directly and solely targeting your own opening, and like this has no other clash. You can't pretend this is a response to the other side. Two things to say. Firstly, phrase it as burden flaws. So say like, not that your opening is wrong, say that like our opening has this gap where they don't explain this thing that would be needed for their impact to arise. This is much better because it just seems like you are describing the round as it is played out and you're judging your opening as opposed to responding to your opening. So I'd focus on that. The second thing you can do is you just do it with jokes and a smile on your face. In the worst case, if you do have to like, I don't know, if you have to like actually respond to them line by line, and there you can just say, here are a couple of nice little things I use. One is saying things like you list out their mechs. You're going to say, look, panel, the openings mechs are a little bit soft. Let me just say them for you. The first mechanism is this. Curious, or something like that, Like just list out the reason and just like hopefully get a laugh. If you don't get a laugh, you're probably gonna have to give up the bit pretty quickly. If you the other way of doing this maybe is something like they say this reason, despite this other thing, which is like a contradiction that exists in their case. So point out attention immediately afterwards. These are ways you can respond, but don't, for God's sake, don't say, "Oh, we beat our opening for 5 reasons. Firstly, they give this mechanism. This mechanism doesn't work. Here's their analysis. Their analysis is based on incorrect premise." Like, don't like respond to them like they're an opposing team. Not going to work. Now, if you're analytically weighing, so for example, you are explaining that you're beating your openings case because you are analytically prior or you're lower burden or whatever, the most important thing you should know here is that you need to derive the impact weighing from the analysis weighing. What does this look like? If your opening side have missed a burden and you are trying to explain that your case is better because you are more applicable than their case. So let's just say that it's a this house regrets motion, and it's this house regrets the glorification of soldiers heroes 2019 World Schools Final. If you are arguing on opposition that the glorification is very, very good because it leads to better supports for soldiers, and the team on proposition is saying that it's very, very bad because it leads to what's it called? If you glorify soldiers as heroes, then it leads to them doing more bad things in warfare. Then, but they haven't explained what the counterfactual is to glorifying soldiers as heroes. And you say the counterfactual is that you still treat them as being very serious, and you still put some sort of guardrails and checks on them regardless. So even if you view them as heroes, there are incentives to do so. But counterfactually, you maybe view them as something else, whatever. So something which means that they can't access their impact. Um, then you should explain why their burden flaw is such that it means they can't impact their case. So point out that the things which they've missed analytically, let's take a simpler example than that case. Let's just say that you are responding to a team or you're weighing against a team who have shown that a actor has an incentive to do a policy but don't have the capacity to do so. You might say, we beat our opponents because we are more certain in achieving our impact than theirs. The reason is they explain to you why you have an incentive to want to do a certain policy, but they don't explain why you're actually able to implement that policy in a appropriate manner. The implication is that they don't have a large amount of they don't have a large amount of scope that is accessed here. I'll give you a specific example where this happened. Round three of Peter Maguire 2025, we are in opening government, and closing government is Jack Williams and Anna Savitska. We argue on the motion about this House believes that we should give more to animal charities than human charities, I think it was. We give a bunch of reasons as to why animals are very, very important, and that if we give money to them, then this would be a good thing, right? But we don't explain that the money is actually going to be spent on the things that we posit it would be good to be spent on. Closing government analytically extend by explaining why you're actually going to spend the money on useful things that would improve the lives of animals. And the weighing is, look, opening government explained that they have a large amount of money, and they explained that animals are very, very vulnerable. And maybe we assume that charities are minimally competent, what that explains is some of that money will be spent on good things. However, they don't explain why the pot of money they have is going to lead to the set of impacts that they claim. However, what we are able to show is that we access far more of the impacts which they espouse by showing that the charities will allocate the money in an effective manner towards the specific problems they highlight. That means that we get more animals that are saved from poaching. It means we have more animals that are not like being killed inside of factory farms. It means we have fewer animals being tested on brutally for things like cosmetics. So doing things like pointing out the specific impacts that you can derive that your opening cannot derive, where you say, look, my opening has a large amount of money, but you don't explain why you're likely to spend it on things like improving factory farming as opposed to spending on like saving some niche animal from extinction, which is something which opening opposition contests, which means that their impact is very unlikely to manifest. Or they save some animals from extinction, we save millions, if not billions, of animals from factory farming. So that's the way you do the comparison. Turn it from analysis weighing into impact weighing. Now, how do you rebut weighing? This is the second to last section. Um, the first thing is you can co-opt your. Actually, this should have been in terms of ordering the presentation earlier, but whatever. You can co-opt an opposing side's metric. So you can say that, look, they access a lot of scale, but our case actually affects a larger scale of people, or their case it affects vulnerable people, but our actor is also vulnerable. If you explain that your stakeholder just as well is like meets the criteria of the weighing, then you wash their weighing metric. If you explain that you have a more vulnerable group than theirs and they're weighing on vulnerability, you flip their weighing metric. That's the way it would work in terms of rebuttal. Another thing is mitigation. So you can say that their impact doesn't actually meet their metric. So, for example, if they're weighing on reversibility and you argue that their impact is actually not very reversible, then this mitigates the extent to which they access their weighing metric. A third thing is you can deny the premise of their weighing. So just say that, like, if, for example, they're weighing on special moral duties between actors, just contest those duties don't exist. If they're weighing on certainty, just say that we don't care about certainty, we care about expected value. Certainty is only one half of the equation, which is how likely something is to happen. The other half of the equation is how important the thing would be if it happens. We have a much, much more important claim. They have a more certain claim. But even if there's a 75% chance of our thing happening and our impact is twice as important as theirs, then that means it's a larger expected outcome. There's no reason why you should care more about their certainty in and of itself. Another thing you can do is margin on metrics. So, for example, take the motion this house supports nuclear energy being built, whatever, nuclear power plants. And we're arguing that nuclear power plants are good because they produce a lot of cheap, like fairly environmentally friendly energy, and it's sustainable and good energy independence and whatnot. And they're arguing that there'll be meltdowns of nuclear reactors on occasion, which are very bad. Clearly they have a very high impact argument and which is like relatively low likelihood, and we have a very likely argument which is lower impact. What we should do is explain that our impact is very, very important, that there's a high degree of importance to it, and then say, look, which impact is more important, people getting access to things which can heat their homes versus people having to evacuate areas when there are meltdowns. It's not entirely clear which side is much more important. However, what is very clear to you, panel, is that we win by a large margin in terms of certainty. Our thing is going to happen far more frequently, and you can be much more sure that it will happen. Consequently, the degree to which they can win on their best metric is very small, and we potentially beat them there on their own grounds. But even if not, we're able to defeat them on this other area of the debate. So mitigate their margin of victory on the area where they're winning, make your margin of victory very big on the area you're winning, weigh the margin of victory in and of itself as important. Now let's talk about practicing weighing. There are three ways you can drill weighing directly. One is you can watch recorded rounds, listen to the PM LO exchange in a recorded round and give reasons why the PM's analysis is preferable to the LO's, for example. So just go and like do some direct weighing when you track speeches. Another is you can judge. So judge rounds, give OAs. In the OAs, do a lot of weighing and very little summary of what teams say and ask teams for feedback on your weighing. Good way to just practice it under pressure. Another thing is you can do spars where you give like whip speeches or deputy speeches doing enormous amounts of weighing without doing much rebuttal and forcing yourself to abandon buzzwords. You can also watch recorded rounds by people who are very good at weighing. Now, in terms of how you improve the underlying skills which allow you to weigh well, one is you can just be more aware within rounds. My old coach, Keegan Hamill, once had said when I asked him for drills to improve my weighing, he said like weighing is debating. If you understand like how arguments interact, then you'll be able to explain like which side wins those interactions. You need to be better at impacting. You need to be better at tracking. You need to be better at understanding which pieces of analysis are like well proven, which bits are not. So how can you improve your round awareness? Things like judging, things like watching rounds and seeing who won and trying to understand why. Things like asking feedback from judges on how your rounds went and why they evaluated certain pieces of analysis in certain ways. Essentially, if you just get a better read on which arguments are proven, which ones aren't, and how comparisons are adjudicated, then you'll get better at understanding where you can apply your weighing. Another thing is impacting. Often, like you weigh your impacts. So if your impacts are better, then your weighing will be better. And also, you like flow your weighing out of your impacting. So for example, if you want to prove that your argument is very intense and more intense than theirs, and you want to weigh that way, one excellent way to do this is to just get better at illustrating the extent of your impact so that people feel it in their gut. And this means doing things like more picture painting, stealing phrases from people who are good at illustrating, making sure that you watch more like documentaries and things so that you can picture impacts inside your head, making sure that you spend more time intentionally writing out pictures. A third thing is on tracking. If you understand what's said in the round, you're more likely to explain why one argument beats another. The best way to get better at tracking is to practice taking down notes on speeches on multiple times speed and comparing your notes back to what was said in the actual debate by looking at recordings in hindsight. Practice this a bunch. If you understand what people say, you'll be able to explain why you weigh over it. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and best of luck with your weighing into the future.